Mita, welcome. It's great to have you on Sweet Talking.
Thanks so much for having me, Leslie. I'm excited for our conversation.
I have been so excited to talk to you about your book,
Oh, thank
Reimagine,
you.
Reimagine Inclusion, which came out in the beginning of October. Let's first talk about the title, Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace. This book took you 4 years to write. And as a writer myself, and as somebody who's passionate about DEI, I'm really excited to talk about the book and the content in it. But first, let's talk about the process of writing it.
Yes.
So what type of wells of resilience did you have to tap into to get this book in the hands of lucky readers?
Well, thanks for that question. I wrote the book 4 years ago, and I faced many of the inequities we face in our workplaces, which is the publishing industry. And I received a lot of no's and a lot of rejections. Things like, there are a lot of people who look like Mita writing books like this. Can she come back to me when she has a proposal more like Sheryl Sandberg? I love Sheryl Sandberg. I've read both of her books. I'm not Sheryl Sandberg. And Mita's writing is masterful. It pops off the page, but she doesn't have enough followers who's going to buy the book. And Leslie, you might think, God, did she memorize those? Yes, I did. Because just like we have a rainy day folder where we save all of our love notes, I hope you all do that when you're having a bad day. You go back to all the notes people have sent to you. I had a rejections folder. I still have over 30, 40 rejections. And why is that important? Because I wanted to see meaningful feedback in my writing, but I wasn't getting meaningful feedback about the writing. I was getting a lot of superficial feedback. And so it's sort of overwhelming now. 4 years later, the book is out. It's a Wall Street Journal bestseller, a USA Today bestseller. And I'm just proof, like, don't let your dream die. It was a book no one wanted 4 years ago. And here we are. And here I am talking to you about it.
Right. And it just hit the Inc. Best books.
Yes, it did. Thank you. You're my publicist as well, Leslie. I love that.
Yes,
as
of yesterday. As of yesterday. So, I think we can all relate to having to stay resilient in the face of rejection. And when I was reading the foreword to the book, or the prologue, the story of you as a little girl really resonated with me. And this idea that if you perform and you exceed expectations and you achieve, that you will be accepted and included, right? That you will hit your goals in the meritocracy.
Yes.
But in the book, and I wanted to give little Mita a hug, right? Because I so identified with those feelings. But in fact, you talk about a meritocracy as opposed to a meritocracy. Tell us what that is.
Well, most of us believe in a meritocracy, don't we? We believe that if you work hard and if you excel and succeed, that you will be given what you have achieved and earned, right? That is what most of us, I think, believe. For me, and one of the terms I researched that I did not coin, but I included in Reimagine Inclusion, is this idea of meritocracies. How is that related? Well, if I have a definition of what meritocracy is, I know what good looks like. I know what excellence looks like. I know what it looks like based on my lived experience. And sometimes I'm drawn to other people who've had my same lived experience. I then start to actually create a meritocracy, which is a team of little mini Mitas, right? They start to mirror. Everyone I bring in starts to mirror me in some way, shape, or form. It could be physically, it could be in terms of education or background or lived experience or what it took to get us to where we are today. And that's what I want really people to think about. Are you just building teams that are only a reflection of yourself?
Right. And, you kind of give a little kind warning in the beginning of the book to readers to allow themselves to be challenged by some of the content and to really question some of their own beliefs. And one of the things that you tackle early on in the book is the expression of being colorblind. So what's wrong with being colorblind?
I think one of the first things that we need to do more as leaders, and anyone listening, I consider everyone a leader. Anyone can make change in their organization and their communities. We have to have the humility to express when we've made mistakes and unlearn things we've been told, so many of us have been told to be colorblind. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that and saying you're going to be color aware or really see people for who they are. Because here's the thing, if you don't see me as brown, if you don't see me as a woman of color, you're actually denying my experience to say that I'm colorblind. And so I ask people too, if you've used the word colorblind, or if you don't feel like color has ever impacted your life journey, then there's some privilege in that, right? Then there's some privilege in that. And so that's what I ask people to think about. When you say colorblind, you don't see me. You don't see me for who I really am.
Right. And that's coming from a pretty significant place of privilege, potentially.
It is. It is. Yeah.
Right. So at Boyden, we're executive search consultants in addition to doing important leadership advisory work. So I was very interested in a lot of the content in the book around recruiting, and specifically this idea of the pipeline myth. What is the pipeline myth?
The pipeline myth is often a myth we create ourselves. We create a lot of internal obstacles to recruiting talent. And so one of the stories I share is years ago, working with a leader in the state of Vermont. So if you're sitting and listening in the US right now, you may know that the state of Vermont is statistically one of the whitest states. And this individual, this white leader, he had a really wonderful goal. He had great intention. He wanted to change the diversity of representation of his leadership team. And he had a role that was open. It was really high level. But here's how the conversation went. The salary wasn't competitive. Leslie, this is all going to sound familiar to you. The salary wasn't competitive versus the market. There was no competitive relocation. And they wanted the job to be in state. This is pre-pandemic. And so what ended up happening? Vermont is about 3% people of color. And so there's not even a pipeline there to draw from. And so, of course, his response was, well, recruiting's not providing me with a diverse slate. I don't know what to do about this. And so they ended up hiring a white leader to fill that role. But do you see how we can create the pipeline myth ourselves? And I know you've seen this in your organization and as you're advising and coaching clients, but here's the thing, there's no excuses anymore post-pandemic. There are just no excuses. Most of us are in a hybrid world. I mean, even our conversation today is virtual. And so how can you say you don't have access to diverse pipelines? I challenge that you're not looking hard enough or you're not working with partners who can help you.
So of course, what jumps out is blaming recruiting when something goes wrong, right?
Oh, of course,
with your pipeline. But joking aside, I think what jumps out in what you're saying is there are not necessarily easy or pat solutions to what is a complex situation. And so companies and leaders have to be really thoughtful and intentional about building diversity and inclusion in their workplace, including through their recruiting processes. So what specific recommendations can you make to ensure that recruiting processes are, in fact, inclusive?
Well, number one, it's not just the job of recruiting to find talent, full stop. Just as you said, blame the recruiters. If you are a leader, it is your job to be always on the lookout for talent. So when you have a chief marketing officer role open, there's no pressure. Oh my God, let me go find Leslie or Mita because we used to work together. No, actually, because I've done succession planning and because I'm always meeting people, I have just a plethora of talent that I'm getting to know. I think that's important. Really working on, and I do this full time and I do this with companies, is how do you interrupt bias during the recruitment process? Is Mita a fit? What does that mean? Would I have a glass of wine with her? What would it be like to be stranded in an airport? What? You hear all kinds of questions. You're like, how is this relevant? And the other thing I would say is really building an ecosystem. So there's your internal recruiters, there's your leaders who you're encouraging to always meet talent, working with search firms, making sure they're in your ecosystem so that you've gotten to know each other. It's not that, oh my God, I have a job right now, Leslie, I need a candidate tomorrow. Working on pipelines and succession planning. And then also building partnerships with organizations that can help you build access to diverse pipelines. National Society of Black Engineers is a great example. I've worked with them over the years. And so it's not just a check the box, but you're building a meaningful relationship, getting them to know your company, and then also getting candidates to know your company as well.
One of the things that always used to interest me, and that's sort of a delicate way of saying it, is that when I was a CHRO, very often HR generalists or recruiters would identify or self-identify themselves as being separate teams. And I would always encourage them to think of themselves as one team, right? So you can't have a sound talent strategy or a people strategy without starting with a really sound talent acquisition strategy,
of course,
including some of the elements that you just described. And so it can't be this sort of constantly reactive process.
And exactly what you said. And so when you're proactive, you will likely never stumble across a lot of these problems because you have been proactive and consistently proactive.
So as both somebody who is hired in the C-suite internally and now on the other side of that transaction in executive search, I have conversations about and have had conversations about the so-called diverse slate, right? How can we talk to our clients about meaningful ways to build that diverse slate? What does that really mean? I have the sense sometimes that people say that because they know that is sort of what they're expected to do or what they think they have to do. But I don't think they necessarily have a clear idea of what that actually means.
And you're getting to the heart of the myth that I talked about in this part of the book. I'm all for diverse talent as long as they're good. I'm all for diverse talent as long as they're good. And so if you have never actually worked with or interviewed or met a woman of color, and all of a sudden I'm working with Leslie and here's the diverse slate, and here shows up Mita, you're like, there's something different about her and it makes me uncomfortable. Let's just be honest, it's human nature. And so if I had enough exposure to talent from different backgrounds, different communities, different lived experiences, when I receive a diverse slate, it's not that surprising or shocking, right? And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the diverse slate, we have the NFL and the Rooney Rule, and we know that even as I put my book out, it's out of date. That's what happens with books. So the NFL has a lot of things that they're contending with right now. But with the Rooney Rule, this idea of having one individual from a historically marginalized community, Harvard Business Review has showed us research that says it actually, if you have two women on a final slate, there's a likelihood of 70% more likelihood that one of them will get the role. And why is that? Because all of a sudden they're not othered. It's not potentially from a gender lens, one woman and 6 men who were on the final slate. Oh, now it's 2 women and the rest are men. And so that's what's important to think about as well when we think about slates and how we present them.
And talk a little bit more about what the slippery slope of fit is, because I'm guilty, of having said that about candidates or even myself, right, as a candidate. And you really go to lengths in the book to talk about how that can be dangerous. So tell us about that.
Absolutely. Because culture fit it's based on how I define the culture. And so if as a company, you don't have a really strong understanding of what your culture is and what your values is, it isn't written, it isn't shared. It's the questions like, I don't know if Leslie has the right energy. I don't know if I would put her up in front of a client. She sounds too young. She sounds too old. She has too much experience. She doesn't have enough. I don't know if we should get along with the rest of the team. She didn't strike me as very social. I could go on and on. And so if I have no set understanding of what the culture means for our company, and it's like a shared understanding, that's when bias comes up. I mean, how is it relevant if I'd have a glass of wine with you or not? Based on a 30-minute initial conversation. I'm just like, I don't think I'd have a glass of wine with her. And based on that actually comes into the debrief as a point of contention.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people pride themselves on having good immediate instincts about people, and that may be true, but I think we have to recognize that, as you point out, that can be very layered with implicit bias from our experiences. But playing devil's advocate for a minute,
sure.
If I'm giving advice to a CEO who's looking to hire for his or her or their C-suite, and they say to me, but Leslie, you're being ridiculous. Of course, the person has to be able to get along with the rest of the team. Why can't I look for somebody who's going to get along with the rest of the team?
Mm-hmm.
How do you respond to that? Because I think that's fair pushback.
Yes, that's a great question. But then I always talk about this on my own podcast called Brown Table Talk. Facts, not feelings. Facts, not feelings. Okay, you feel like Leslie. I keep picking on you, Leslie, because you're here. I feel like Leslie wouldn't get along. Okay, but let's go to the facts. What does her track record of success say? Actually, Leslie's last role was client facing, and she submitted some reference from former clients who said that she was an incredibly strong partner and helped them achieve their goals. Right. And so, like, there are other ways to go back to the experience and translate get along well with others. Are they a team player? Are they collaborative? Does Leslie have experience of when she has had to work on a really difficult project and gather people together toward that goal or vision? So that's what I would challenge people, is that, yes, of course, you want to make sure that this person is going to make impact ultimately, but go back to the experience versus the coded language.
I like the facts, not feelings mantra. I think that's easy to remember and something that you can kind of challenge yourself with when you're going down a particular path.
Yes.
So getting to negotiations over job offers, because that's another place where, you know, I think you can find these issues rear their head. What particular issues do you find women and or people of color, but particularly I'm thinking about women in this particular question because of the chapter in the book about women's compensation. What challenges do you find that women face when they're negotiating their packages, and how is that a DEI issue?
I love that question. So the myth is, why are you asking for a raise? You and your husband make more than enough money. Yes, that is the story. You all can go and check it out. But the myth I'm trying to debunk there is that white women and women of color don't negotiate. There is a myth that women don't negotiate. I think that's changed over the years. Certainly my own upbringing and my own discomfort with money and cultural upbringing, you don't talk about where you vacation, how much you make, what you're wearing. Like, I was raised like that. And then you come into the workforce, you're like, fight for your money, fight for your pay. It's uncomfortable. And so what I argue is many of us have upskilled ourselves to negotiate. Many women of color and white women do negotiate. And when they negotiate, they're gaslit, dismissed, and minimized as a result. I've had this happen with executive recruiters, search firms. I've had this happen over the years internally with managers. I've had this happen when I'm up for a promotion. And so that's what I really want people to think about, is what are the biases we have on the roles we think women and men should play. And some of that is deep-seated cultural, home, media, TV. And then we actually have those things show up at work on when we decide to pay someone less. And why is that?
Yeah, you know, I think about this a lot. Again, you know, as over the years, as a candidate, as a CHRO, and now as an executive search consultant, I think about this issue a lot. And, you know, I heard another speaker recently say that women, and we're going to hearkening back now to Sheryl Sandberg, you know, women were encouraged to lean in.
Yes.
Right. And so women leaned in and then they got pushed back. Right. So to your point, many women, even though they did find it uncomfortable and outside their comfort zone to negotiate meaningfully around compensation, they nevertheless found that they got a lot of pushback about it.
And there are things that I've heard in closed doors. I'm sure you've heard these things as well. Mita carries a Birkin bag. She doesn't really need this job. We don't need to give her that raise. Mita's husband, Jim, is in sales and killing it in the same company. You can move that 10% merit increase down to a 5%. Mita's the primary breadwinner. She's not going anywhere. We don't need to give her a retention bonus, and so on and so on. And so what I want people to think about is the mental and emotional tax and burden that many of us face in our workplaces, particularly on this issue. You know, I don't have the privilege to wear a hoodie to work, but when I do wear all of my nice logo items, nice shoes, nice jackets, wonder how she's affording that. And so it's the double bind. And so I know many women, including myself, I won't wear the nicest things when I know it's pay review time or up for negotiation. And how sad is that? Because we've earned it. We've earned it.
So you talked a little bit about before when we were discussing the issue of a diverse slate and this idea that it's not a diverse slate if you have one of something other necessarily. how can organizations ensure that their DEI efforts don't fall into the trap of tokenism?
That's a great question. Part of it is being consistent. And I think just personally, have you ever felt used by someone or tokenized by someone in your personal life? Right? Like, oh, they only showed up in that one moment where they needed me. Similar thing when you think about our workplaces. And so really think about, what are you doing consistently when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion? And when it comes to diverse slates, it is what gets measured gets done. And you're not going to do everything overnight. And so perhaps you'll start with a gender lens. And I always say with gender, don't forget women of color. But it's not that you're going to necessarily do everything overnight. But once you start measuring one thing and you start doing that successfully, you start seeing the wins pile up, and that there are other things that you can start to branch out to. But I think one of it is, you have to be consistent in what you do. And we're seeing right now many chief diversity officer roles being cut amid the DE&I backlash. And so for those companies who have really stopped efforts, in 2-3 years from now, if they're trying to recruit candidates might be like, well, I feel like, I don't know if I want to work here based on your lack of a track record.
So speaking of chief diversity officers, in light of the Supreme Court decision around the use of race preference in academic settings, and certainly there have been articles about advocates who plan on taking that decision in the academic setting and using it as a platform to object to and challenge programs within corporations. What do you see as the future of the chief diversity officer?
Well, I would argue that it's probably it started back with Roe v. Wade last June being overturned, books being banned in Florida and Texas. Hopefully, we'll see, my book's probably going to be banned there. States like Florida and Texas, where my role as a chief diversity officer would not exist in public educational institutions, they have effectively been banned. And so here's what I think. I believe that this work will continue on and must continue on because inclusion is a driver of the business. So you'll see the market start to get bifurcated, woke, anti-woke, political, apolitical. But I'll bring up the business case, Leslie, because I think it's important. From a US perspective, we know right now 40% of individuals identify as non-white. That number is drastically changing. And so think about that from a talent acquisition strategy, as you were mentioning earlier. Procter & Gamble is just one source that tells us there's over $5 trillion of spending power with the multicultural consumer. That doesn't include veterans, individuals with disabilities, LGBTQ plus community, and more. So think about all these different dimensions of diversity, and are their needs actually being served authentically and met, and what companies can be doing. And so the market, I believe, will become bifurcated. You'll have Coinbase and Basecamp over here, two famous tech companies who said during the pandemic, we're not doing DE&I efforts here, no more talk about social justice. One of those companies, Leslie, during the pandemic, the founder makes the announcement, within a week, 30% of employees say, I'm gone. And then you've got Patagonia, you've got Ben & Jerry's, you have companies who are like, hey, here are our values, here's what we stand for. We're not going to waver. And then you have everyone else kind of plotted along. And so then as soon as the pendulum swings and I, Mita, as an employee, I, as talent, have the power to choose where I want to work, I will make that choice of companies that match my values.
Yeah, I remember years ago, and I did not coin this phrase, but I think it's brilliant. It actually, to give it an attribution, it was John Boudreau out of USC Business School. And he talked about this coming democratization of the workforce. And this was easily 5+ years ago. Wow. Right. And I remember at the time he was talking about it in reference to the gig economy. But I've thought about that phrase very often over the last couple of years, right? As we've seen, the pandemic, and then we saw the massive outcry after the murder of George Floyd. And it doesn't seem as if that is changing, right? You have a very self-determined workforce.
Yes.
Right. And one of the things that I noticed in one of my CHRO roles at an organization I worked for, we had a very diverse organization. And this goes to your concept of the business case. Very, very diverse organization across essentially every category. Right. And it was a tremendous motivator to the workforce. they consistently rank that as their highest source of engagement and pride in the organization was this diversity. And so how, from a business perspective, right, how can you argue against that? So, highly engaged workforces deliver results.
So the question is whether, as leaders, we believe it or not. Do we believe inclusion is a driver of the business? Yes or no? And if we do believe it, it will be a competitive advantage. And when we don't believe it, we will be left behind.
So what is the good news on the DEI front, other than your book?
Oh, well, the good news is there are so many companies doing great work out there. I always talk about Sephora. I spend way too much money with you all, Sephora. I'm a beauty obsessive, but I look at a Sephora. It's a case study I include in Reimagine Inclusion. They had a racist in-store incident. A customer accused them of a racist interaction with a beauty advisor. Gosh, 5-6 years ago. And you look at the trajectory of that company and what they've done since then. It's remarkable. It is everything from they commissioned the first ever of its kind, a bias study around racial bias in store. They use that study. They actually revamp how they do business. And then they actually sign with a nonprofit called Open to All. And they get J.Crew and Banana Republic and other retailers to sign on to the findings of the study so that they can actually start thinking about the in-store experience of customers. And then they've also started an accelerator program for BIPOC founders because they strongly believe that they have an obligation to get more Black and brown founders on shelf and online. And so Sephora is investing money to help them think about, hey, Mita has a lipstick product. How does she actually think about the idea of the lipstick product and actually get it on shelf in our store? So a lot more there, but that's what makes me hopeful. I do see a lot of companies who are doing the right thing. And guess what? We're going to make mistakes. Of course, they've made mistakes, but it's also interesting to see when they make a mistake, how they bounce back stronger and even better.
So, I mean, a couple of takeaways are clearly jumping from this conversation that I hope people who are listening to this will jot down, right, and kind of use as a primer. Facts, not feelings. You can't manage what you don't measure, and that applies to DEI efforts,
yes,
as well as anything else in your business that you want to manage. The importance of having agnostic core values that you can measure candidates against to avoid that slippery slope of the fit. Is there anything else that you would want to put out there as sort of another mantra, right, that people could take from this discussion going forward as they're looking at their own DEI programs and how they might have an impact?
I'm going to leave everyone with one simple thought. I know we're all waiting for the CEO to do something. I'm sure the CEO and the C-suite, of course, they have to do something, but be the reason someone feels included at work. Be the reason. Be that person. Watch what's happening on your team, with your peers, with your colleagues. Has someone suddenly gone quiet? Do they seem disengaged? Do they seem less interested to be there? What's happening? Be the reason that somebody else feels like they belong on your team and in your workplaces. And we all can do that for each other.
So I want to close. I want to go back to the little girl in the prologue of the book, young Mita, right? You wrote that prologue, obviously, before the book was published, before it ended up on all these best book lists. So if you could talk to that little girl now, what would you say to her?
It's going to be okay, and buckle up. We're in for a wild ride. And I wrote this book for, as you read in the prologue, for my own 2 children, Jay and Priya, and for my nephew and 2 nieces, and for all of our kids. I want the world of work to be different than when I entered it. And I know it will be because of all the work I'm doing, because of all the work you're doing, and your company as well. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you. It's been great to have you, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you.